In 2011, we were treated to the first episode of a fantasy epic, full of intrigue, plotting and murder, by the most powerful families of the land. A story that captured the attention of millions around the globe. Now, that show may have become all but completely forgotten by now, but our own history really is stocked full of such things, and indeed that history inspired much of the story. The 11th century alone has enough to make at least 4 excellent seasons of TV. This is the early Norman rule of England, when brother turned on brother for England's crown. This is our Game of Thrones. From the end of the Roman Empire, what today we call England was ruled by a number of distinct Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, most notably East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria and Wessex, before unifying as the Kingdom of England in the early 10th century. There was a brief rule by Danish King Canute the Great, but ultimately the Anglo-Saxon kingdom would come to its complete end with the arrival of William, Duke of Normandy, and the death of Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings on the 14th of October 1066, an event from which history has granted William the epithet the Conqueror. With the other claimants dead and having burned his way to London, William was crowned king at Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day. But it wasn't plain sailing for the new Norman dynasty. He spent the next 10 years subjugating and removing the English nobility to replace them with his own supporters. His most brutal actions are known as the Harrying of the North, but we're going to have to cover that one another time, unless you want me to sit here for 3 or 4 hours. Much of William's later rule was marred by a bitter relationship with his eldest son Robert Curthose, or Robert Shortpants if you were to use more modern parlance. The nickname was given to him by his father, and I can't imagine anyone being pleased that the name would go into the history books as Shortpants. Sometime in the 1070s, Robert had been given the Duchy of Normandy by his father. However, it appears that despite becoming King of England, he just could not bring himself to relax his grip on his homeland. Between his father's dominance and his mother Matilda's own significance in Norman politics, Robert must have been frustrated at being third choice for the running of the duchy. He demanded his father hand over Normandy to him. He'd already been recognised as the Duke's heir, and acted as regent whenever his father was away in England. In fact, he had been left to administrate the duchy when his father had set sail for war in 1066. At this time, however, he was rebuffed.
"What you ask, my son, is quite preposterous. It is shameful to wish to deprive your father of the dominions, which, if you are worthy, you will receive from him in due course."
Robert was not pleased with this answer, and stormed out. And tensions then came to a head in the autumn of 1077, when Robert's younger brothers, William and Henry, purportedly played a prank on him, by emptying a full chamber pot on him from a gallery above. And if you don't know what a chamber pot is, remember, the flushable toilet is a recent invention. Enraged, Robert had sought to deal with his younger brothers with his fists, only to have the brawl broken up by his father, who then failed to punish the troublesome piss throwers. Incensed that his father seemed to favour his younger brothers over him, and dissatisfied with waiting for his inheritance, Robert took with him the sons of many of William's supporters, and rode to the castle at Rouen, and attempted to wrest control of it. They failed, and in his fury, King William demanded the malcontents be arrested. Upon hearing of this, Robert and his followers fled to the castle of Remillard, taking refuge with Hugh de Chateauneuf. Robert then sought the support of King of the Franks, Philip I, and retreated to Gerbois, on the borders of Normandy. Robert then set to warring with his father, conducting raids on Normandy, supported by many of William's continental enemies, from Bretagne, Maine, and Anjou. With his own son a threat on the borders of Normandy, William wasted little time and raised his army to confront Robert. When William laid siege in January of 1079, Robert and his forces surged from the castle, taking William's army by surprise. During the melee, Robert unknowingly wounded his father in the arm, and even managed to unhorse him, though he reportedly stopped when he heard his father's voice. Now, details do get a little bit murky here. There's one account that says Robert then dismounted from his own horse and offered it to his father, showing himself an honourable and dutiful son, despite his rebellion. Yet another account says that William was saved by an Englishman named Toki, who gave him his horse before being cut down. In either case, injured and humiliated, William retreated to Rouen. Now there must have been a pause in the conflict, as soon after this, both William and Robert are mentioned attending a new treaty signed with King Philip in 1079. Nevertheless, word of William's defeat spread back to England, and Malcolm, King of Scotland, took an opportunity to begin raiding south. William was forced into reconciliation with his son, likely with heavy assistance from his wife. He still refused to relinquish control, but again promised Robert Normandy upon his death. The family spat, that had left many men dead, was settled in early 1080, and their relationship appears restored. Father and son crossed to England together for the first time, and Robert was entrusted with an army to deal with the raids. And, well, you're hardly going to give an army to someone you think is going to betray you. Robert proved effective in dealing with the Scots, confronting Malcolm, who made peace with him, and even named him godfather to his daughter, Edith, a young woman who will become important to our story a little later. In 1087, William the Conqueror lay dying in Rouen. He had been wounded during a battle at Mantes, on the border of the French Vexin. Robert was seemingly in France as part of another rebellion against his father, though it's uncertain whether this was related to the battle that mortally wounded William. In fact, there's a lot around William's death that we just don't know. Orderic Vitalis, a contemporary chronicler, writes many glorious but most likely entirely fictitious accounts of his death, probably inspired by how he believed this strong royal figure would act in his final hours. Another writing, on the death of William, is a patchwork of other accounts with details and names altered to make a consistent narrative. If, however, we do assume that his will was carried out accurately, on his deathbed, William divided his dominion amongst his sons. During this time there were no clear succession rules, but it does appear relatively common among the Norman baronage that the first son would receive that which his father had inherited, but that which was acquired could be given to the other sons. And so, Robert received Normandy as promised. William's second son, Richard, had died some years before hunting in the New Forest, so it was his third son, William Rufus, who received the crown and sceptre of England, and his fourth son, Henry, later to become one of the most important men in English history, received a lot of money, but no lands of his own. Throughout much of his life, it appears Henry may have been destined for the church. His education was overseen by the Bishop of Salisbury, and in 1084, while Robert and William Rufus were on campaign with the Conqueror, he was left at the Benedictine monastery of St. Mary's in Abingdon. He was surprisingly literate as a result, and could even read English, despite everyone else in his father's dynasty only speaking Norman French. While Robert received the nickname of Curthose, and William II's nickname Rufus means the Red, Henry was known as Beauclerk, which means good scholar, though he would very soon prove to be every bit his father's son, ruthless and determined. As Henry received this lesser lot, and hoped he would later receive the lands of his mother in Buckinghamshire and Gloucestershire, there was apparently some friction between the older sons. I mean, who'd have thought? William Rufus had left his father's side early and rushed off to England to secure his crown, and Robert was especially unhappy that he didn't inherit all of his father's lands, believing that Rufus had stolen the throne from him, that he had rushed to take the crown before their father had even died. While he plotted against Rufus, he made a deal with Henry, selling him the lands of Cotentin, and making him a count to help finance those plans. The new division between England and Normandy also created issues for the Norman nobility, who held lands in both territories. With the lands now under two rivaling lords, any upsetting of the delicate balance or support of one brother over the other could result in some of their territory being confiscated. In 1088, figuring the best solution was to get rid of one of those lords, at the urging of Bishop Odo Abeu, who probably hoped to reclaim some of his previous wealth and holdings in England, they decided to revolt against the younger William in favour of placing Robert on the throne. However, Robert's planned invasion never took place. Bad weather at sea stalled those plans, as it did with so many invasions of the time, and the uprisings planned to ignite across the country failed to just get started or unite. As a result, William Rufus would successfully defeat the rebels stuck in England, besieging Robert's allies as they waited for supplies and troops from a second fleet that would also never arrive. With many of the rebels surrendering, and their hopes in tatters, William was able to tighten his grip on the throne. After his brother's failed invasion, Henry decided now was the right time to ask William to hand over his mother's estates. He was refused. In fact, those lands had already been given to one of William's allies. And then, when he returned to Normandy, Odo had convinced Robert that his younger brother was conspiring against him, and so had confiscated the title and lands he had sold Henry mere months earlier. And then he threw Henry in jail for 6 months, until other members of the Norman nobility convinced Robert to release him. While no longer a count, Henry continued to exercise influence and control over much of western Normandy. In 1090, the two older brothers sought to gather support from different nobles across both Normandy and England. While Robert managed to once again gain the support of King Philip, William instead managed to convince Conan. No, not that one. No, not that one either. Look, he convinced a wealthy burgher named Conan Pilatus and some of the other wealthy townspeople of Rouen, the capital of Normandy, to offer him the city. And without Rouen, Robert's control of Normandy would crumble. So he called on his supporters, and even had the audacity to seek the help of Henry, even after having taken his lands from him. Nevertheless, Henry rode to his aid. Fighting broke out in the city as citizen fought citizen in a savage melee. Robert and Henry, accompanied by their knights, joined the chaotic battle. At some point, it appears Robert was encouraged to leave the fighting, lest he be injured or killed. Henry, however, remained, rallying Robert's supporters and turning the tide against the rebels. As the battle abated, Conan himself was captured and brought before Henry, who marched him up the long spiral staircase of Rouen Castle's great tower. Apparently, trembling with anger at the commoner's treason, Henry threw Conan from the topmost room of the tower, and then had his body tied to a horse and dragged through the city as a warning to other potential traitors. For decades after, the tower would become known as Conan's Leap. While Henry emerged from the riot as a hero, Robert's reputation plummeted. With his capital in grave danger, he had seemingly fled to safety, while his younger brother of nearly 15 years fought bravely to save his duchy. Then, just a year later, in 1091, William invaded Normandy. The wealth of England called to so many of the Norman barons, and rather than lose all control, Robert was forced to negotiate, ceding some of his lands to William. But Robert didn't actually come out too badly from this. In the negotiations, they agreed to become each other's heirs, excluding Henry from any chance of succession while they lived. And the agreement gave Robert an ally against Henry, for he had been gathering significant support and power. The two older brothers turned their armies against Henry, forcing him into exile at Britannia. Robert and William continued to work together, for a little while, until they fell out again, because apparently none of these brothers can seem to get on for any length of time at all. Between 1092 and 1094, Henry stubbornly rebuilt his power in western Normandy, taking advantage of the tensions between his older brothers, and the disputes arising on the borders of Normandy. In 1094, William threw off his treaty with Robert, and made another grab for Normandy. He used the treasury of England to buy mercenaries, bribed the French king to stay out of things, and not a lot else. He tried to reach out to Henry for assistance, but was initially forced to return to England. Despite this, he did actually manage to openly bring Henry to his side, and he began sending him money to harass Robert. Before things got too heated, in early 1096, calls for the First Crusade made its way through to Normandy. The Pope's pilgrims were to make war on God's behalf and free the holy city from the occupying infidels. Knights willing to answer God's call and take the cross were to be ready to depart in August 1096. Robert, possibly looking to regain some of his image and possibly hoping for some forgiveness for his sins, took his vow to join the crusade. But to do so, he was going to need money. The church would not be able to equip all the summoned fighters in time, and so the costs of outfitting their knights fell to the individual nobles. Horses, armour and shields, sword and lance, grooms, squires, cooks, huntsmen, pack animals to carry the supplies of both men and beast. The cost was going to be immense. So he mortgaged Normandy to William. Of course, he'd have to pay back this loan upon his return, or, in the case of his death, then the duchy would finally belong to William. Taking advantage of this time while Robert waged war, Rufus played an active ruler in Normandy, trying to establish his power there. But in the year 1100, word arrived that not only was Robert returning home, but he was also bringing a bride with him. Despite being 50, he had married Sibylla of Conversano, the daughter of a wealthy count, and through that marriage he was now bringing with him the funds to pay back his debt to William and buy back his duchy. I couldn't actually find much of what Henry did in this time. He seems to have kept fairly quiet. But alongside the news of Robert's return, he reappears in the history books, going hunting with William. Now, William the Conqueror adored hunting, and William Rufus appeared to inherit his father's love of it. But accidents are common in hunting, and unfortunately for the younger William, his fate would echo that of his younger brother Richard. On the 2nd of August in the year 1100, King William Rufus took his party into the New Forest. While following a stag, William suddenly took an arrow in his chest. The king instinctively broke the shaft of the arrow, dropped onto buckled knees, and without a word escaping his lips, he toppled forward into the dirt, pushing the remainder of the arrow deeper into him. The entire hunting party scattered, abandoning their dead king where he fell. The supposed killer, Walter Tyrrell, fled straight to France, though he would swear even on his deathbed that he did not loose that fateful arrow. William's body would later be collected by a servant and tossed in a cart to be taken to Winchester Cathedral for burial. The time between the death of a king and the coronation of the next was always a moment of turmoil. William's lords rushed to secure their possessions and maybe seize what they could elsewhere for as long as the power vacuum remained. Henry, for his part, rode straight for Winchester, leaving his brother in the dirt, aiming to arrive before any news of the royal death got out. If he could secure the royal treasury, he'd be a foot in on securing the crown for himself. Robert Curthose was still in foreign lands, and he hadn't yet returned to Normandy, and so no claimant was near to stop Henry. The barons of Winchester wasted no time in putting their support behind Henry as king, hoping they could stop the political instability before it turned to war. Henry then headed for London, and was crowned quickly. So quickly, in fact, it was done before either of the archbishops could arrive. Now, accidents certainly happen, and I'm not saying assassination, but something's mighty suspect here, especially as it all happened just after news that Robert would be returning. The sources seem to express belief that William's death was divine justice, and that he got what was deserved, painting him as a bad king. But it is hard to find fair accounts of William Rufus. His lack of bastard children and unwillingness to marry, even years into his reign as king, resulted in frequent accusations of homosexuality, which, obviously to the church, was enough to paint him as immoral and unfit to be king. And you can guess where you're going to find the most amount of literate people of the time capable of writing the history books. The truth of William Rufus's character, and whether or not he was even gay, has been lost to history. Robert, finding himself denied England's throne once again, was furious. William had already declared him heir in their treaty, so for Henry to undermine that would have not only been a usurpation of his rightful position, but would have broken Henry's own oaths to him as well. He raised an army through the autumn, preparing for an invasion. Henry, meanwhile, would not remain idle. As his brother began gathering soldiers, he began making moves to win support in England, bringing the barons and the church on side through the Charter of Liberties, agreeing to things like not to take or sell church properties, cancelling debts to his brother, recusing himself for ever taking bribes when barons commit crimes, and no longer requiring a tax of grain or goods from those who offered military service. Importantly for Henry here, by appeasing the church, he could rely on them to send him their force of knights when he demanded. Through this charter, he not only cemented support away from his older brother, but ensured a strong military presence would be available to him. He also sought to gain the support of the English, and to do so married a certain figure named Edith. And if you remember, I did mention her a little earlier. Edith, the daughter of King Malcolm of the Scots, and most importantly for Henry, she was also the daughter of Margaret of Wessex, the sister of Edgar Atheling. Henry hoped that Edith's descent from royal English stock would help his cause. But this then upset many of the Norman nobility, and so to appease them, Edith would change her name to Matilda, which, from my research, seems to be the only name that Norman women could have. It crops up more than the name William does. On the 20th of July, 1101, Robert Curthose's fleet set sail. It met with Henry's flotilla, but they did choose to join Robert. His forces then landed at Portsmouth Harbour, somewhere near our little fort of Porchester here, and began to march on Winchester. Curthose appears to have received word that the Queen, his goddaughter, was in Winchester, so rather than try and fight and seize the city and the treasury, he seemingly decided to wait for Henry at Alton. The two armies met, Robert and his battle-hardened crusaders, many nobles of Normandy, and the most powerful magnates of England, while Henry stood with many bishops, abbots, and their hundreds of knights. Rather than face Henry's army in battle, he was persuaded to meet at the negotiating table, quite possibly because facing so much of the church could have led to his excommunication. Now, whatever occurred during these negotiations, Robert would renounce his claim to the throne, accepting Henry's coronation as king in exchange for Henry conceding all but one of his holdings in Normandy, and a yearly payment of 3,000 marks. Finally, much as had been done with William Rufus in the years before, they both named each other as heir in the case that neither of them had legitimate offspring. This clause was essentially meaningless though, as both their wives would give birth to sons the following year. And both would be named William. Crying out loud. Okay, so from Robert and Sybil would be William Clito, and from Henry and Matilda would be William Adelin, which is a corruption of the Anglo-Saxon name Aetheling. Both nicknames mean prince, which really, it does not help me distinguish the players in this Game of Thrones any further. I mean, did the Normans have to name 3/4 of their population William? Because it damn well seems like it. Henry soon set about ignoring their treaty, and increasing the tensions in Normandy, exerting his influence by marrying off his own bastard daughters, of which he had many, to potential allies, and he also began gradually eliminating any of Robert's remaining allies in England. Robert, unfortunately, did little to respond, perhaps because his wife Sybil fell ill shortly after the birth of their son, and she died in March of 1103. Over the next couple of years, Henry continued stoking the fires of rebellion, and several Norman castles openly switched their allegiance to him. In the early months of 1105, one of Henry's closest advisors had been harrying the countryside of Normandy, until he was finally attacked and captured. Henry then used this as a pretense for restoring order, gathered his army which he had spent the last year outfitting under massive taxation, and sailed for Normandy. Arriving at Barfleur, he marched on Bayeux, and when the city refused to surrender to him, he set fire to it. The castle, town, its cathedral and churches, along with the inhabitants, burned as Henry moved onwards towards Caen. There they would surrender, fearful of meeting the same fate as Bayeux. Before Henry could continue his march, however, long-coming threats of excommunication arrived. Henry called off his campaign and met with Robert for negotiations, which failed, and so he returned to England for now, until he could appease the church. He returned the following year. Robert had laid a trap at Saint-Pierre-sur-Devers. The abbot there pretended to offer to surrender his fortified abbey to Henry, but before Robert's forces could arrive and spring the trap, the garrison inside the abbey gave the game away, hurling insults at Henry's men, who responded by again burning it to the ground. Henry now marched on Tanchebray and besieged the castle there. He was unable to capture it before Robert came and ordered Henry to lift the siege. But Henry refused. Robert now tried one last time at the negotiating table, but Henry was ready to force a final battle. It's said that the battle took place on the 28th of September 1106, which would put it at 40 years to the day since William the Conqueror and his army landed in Pevensey in England. The battle lasted for about an hour. Yeah, that is it. An hour for a battle that would decide who would rule both England and Normandy. For one of the brothers, it would be an utter disaster. Robert Curthose's superior experience meant little when, well, not only was he outnumbered, but his main support, Robert Beleme, abandoned the field, allowing his forces to fall into disarray to be easily mopped up by Henry's army. During the short melee, Robert Curthose would be captured, along with many of his allied nobles. It was rather common in medieval wars that after a battle, noble prisoners would be held to ransom and released shortly after it was paid. But Henry now held his brother entirely at his mercy. Henry marched Robert through several ducal strongholds, ordering them to surrender, and having Curthose release the men from their oaths to him. He repeated this at Rouen, Normandy's capital and seat of power, officially settling the change of regime. Henry had no way of legally removing his brother as Duke, but as long as Robert was his prisoner, Henry exercised de facto control of the duchy, becoming the second ruler of both England and Normandy. Henry remained in the duchy until 1107, while he moved his prisoners back to England. Robert Curthose would begin his long imprisonment under Henry at Devizes Castle in Wiltshire, in the custody of Roger, the Bishop of Salisbury, one of Henry's wealthiest magnates. He spent 20 years in the bishop's custody, until he was moved to Cardiff Castle. There he lived until his early 80s, spending nearly 30 years of his life imprisoned by his brother. Though he had successfully gained control of both the Kingdom of England and the Duchy of Normandy, Henry's troubles were far from over. But for now, I think we'll end the story here. Thank you all so much for watching, and thanks to everyone who's been liking and subscribing. I reached 1,000 subs after my last video, and for anyone who knows YouTube, that's an important milestone for any budding channel to hit. So yeah, huge thanks to all of you. And I will have more for you again very soon. Bye for now.